There's a great article written in the Atlantic, and I want to basically go over it with you guys. It's titled "Rich People are great at spending money, so they can make their kids rich too." Now, this goes on to talk about wealth, obviously wealth inequality, and what poor and rich people spend their money on. Now, it starts out saying that the poor spend relatively more on what keep them alive because they must, and the rich spend more on what will keep them rich because they can. Now, there was a interesting graph on here that showed what people spend their money on and what income bracket they're in. Basically, to the far left, the richest 10% spend much less of their income on food. To the right, the richest 10% spend much more of their income on things like insurance and education as well. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, I know a lot of poor people. I have been a poor person before, so I understand. And I know that, yeah, poor people, it makes sense. Poor people spend more money on things that keep them alive than they do on anything else. Than they do on education, than they do on insurance, than they do on things that are basically luxuries to them. Investments, etc. You're not going to find a poor person with a 401k. It's not going to happen. Or a securities, right? You're not going to find poor people spending money on stuff like that. No, it's because they're poor. All their money goes to keeping them alive. Food, housing, transportation, etc. Healthcare. So it continues. When you have money, you spend less on the stuff that ensures you survive the day and move on, or more on stuff that ensures that you and your children and your possessions and your estate survive and thrive for many years. See, that's one of the advantages the wealthy have over people who are less fortunate. So again, you get, stuff that keeps your wealth in your family. Basically, wealth begets wealth. You start out on a good footing, you're more likely to stay on that good footing and continue to hold wealth. That's where we're seeing the issue of generational wealth. One generation, back in the day, you might have worked really hard, built a company, and there are plenty of examples of that. You build this successful company, successful business, sort of like Walmart. It's a great example. The guy who created Walmart, Sam Walton, created this business, and now all of his kids have it, inherit it. And of course, his kids are pricks that are holding more wealth than, 42% of all Americans? One family holds more wealth than 42% of America? There's something wrong there. But that's a good example of generational wealth. It continues. Now, poverty is a chaos that screams in the present tense, and the anxiety of having no money forces poor families to direct their attention to immediate concerns. Once again. Now, it also points out how there's not the issue of, it's not just the issue of inequality that's important. It's also the issue of class immobility. Now, we're always going to have an unequal society. Now, we have a more unequal society now than we've had in a very, very long time. And we do need to take steps to address that massive inequality, to kind of close the gap a little bit. But we're always going to have a bit of an unequal system, and that's fine. What we also have, the also big problem, is the problem of not being able to move up in your social class. Social mobility is also down. It is much, much harder for somebody on the bottom who starts out at the bottom to claw themselves up to the top. I mean, those bootstraps, they sound nice in theory, don't they? Well, if you're conservative. But they don't exactly work. No matter how hard you work, it seems it's very, very, very difficult just to get up to a place where a lot of people start. And that's one of the big problems for people at the bottom. It gets to a point where it's no matter how hard you work, you will never make it to that. That's the problem with immobility. And it says it's about lower income people being able to make more money. And that is a very difficult thing. It is so much easier to make money when you start out with having money. Now, this gets on into the habits as well of rich people compared to poor people. Now, rich couples do live in richer districts, obviously, so they have more access to quality education. That's that's a huge problem that people in the inner city, for example, don't have. So you live in a poorer community, there's less money to go to that school, you're going to get a lesser quality of education. That does matter. Now, like I said, rich couples live in richer districts. They also read more to their kids. Well, they're probably home more often and more literate and also have more time. When you're working 2-3 jobs, you can't exactly stop and read to your kids, and it's very important to do. I also mentioned how they send them to better schools, but they also hooked them up with internships, and this is where nepotism kind of comes into play as well, and connections. Connections seem to be more important than credentials these days. I have some personal experience with that. You can have all the credentials that you want, but it's more likely that somebody who has connections with this company or with specific people or has a well-known family name is going to get that spot over you, even if you have better credentials. It's something that exists in our society, and more people need to address that and realize that that is an actual thing. Nepotism and connections, they do matter. For example, nepotism, people who are wealthy, who have a family business that is very successful, are more often to get a job in that family business, or at least in that family industry. That helps keep that wealth in the family. And it also doesn't help for somebody who has those qualifications but can't get into those positions. It keeps those other people out. Also, families tend to pass down their insured and well-invested wealth down to their kids. We see trust fund kids all the time. Get your Paris Hiltons. Now, I mentioned education earlier, but it doesn't play as an important role as it used to because of those different factors, because of nepotism, because of connections, and some people are just more well connected through their family name, through their already inherited wealth than other people, and it makes it much more difficult. It's easy to get into. It's much easier to get into a good job when you know people, even if you're not as highly educated as someone else. And also, that access to a good quality education is harder and harder and harder for people to be able to get. And that's that's really one of the big problems here. Now, I also want to point out what rich people spend their money on compared to poor people. Now, the richest families spend less on food, obviously, clothes, housing, and cars than the poorest family when it comes to shares of income. And it's important to point out that usually they also have better stuff, better quality of stuff, better quality food, better quality clothes, bigger houses, more expensive houses, and better cars. And it takes less of their wealth. But when you're broke, when you're poor, you have less of those resources to be able to spend. You have less money to spend, so all of your stuff is of lesser quality. You have lesser quality food, stuff that's very, very heavily processed and quite unhealthy, which leads to, of course, health problems. You eat bad food, you're going to have some health problems. Can't afford good food, well, you're stuck with what you're stuck with. You get a crappy car, you're more apt to break down in the job, lose your job from having a breakdown, as well as possibly incurring very, very expensive repairs. And you're more likely to get pulled over if you have a shittier quality of a car. So those are things important to point out as well. And you also don't have a home. Your home is one of the biggest factors of building wealth, because you can have a lot of capital in that home. That is one of the major parts of having assets. It's a major asset to have. A lot of poorer people either don't have a home or don't have a home that you can put a lot of capital into that's worth a lot. So that's some of the differences, and as well as inheritance. If you have an inheritance, obviously that's wealth. That's going to help build your personal wealth, and it's going to build on each other. You have to have money in order to make money, And that's something that poor people will never have because they lack money. So it really does show kind of the difference of life, of quality of life, and the different things that they're able to do with that wealth. Poor people versus wealthier people. I'm not saying that wealthy people are necessarily bad people, that they're evil, that they should lose all their wealth. But the thing is that this shows that there is a huge disparity in the way people live. There are two different Americas. There are the haves and then there are the have-nots. And it's a truth in America that a lot of people don't like to see because they haven't actually experienced that. I understand, and I think the only way you ever will understand as a person is if you do go through this kind of stuff and you do understand what it's like